All right, thank you, everyone. Can everybody in the room hear me and also on Zoom? Yes, sound good. Hello, if I haven't met you yet, my name is Lauren. I'm going to be continuing our series on women in the church, women in theology. Really excited for that today. Were any of you here last week for Ruth Ann's talk?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay, awesome. We're going to be kind of building off of that a little bit. If you remember last week, Ruth Ann spoke in kind of two parts. She talked about a modern-ish history of women in ministry in the Episcopal Church and kind of went through deaconesses to deacons to priests and what that looked like for women as they took on each of those different roles, and kind of advocated for themselves to be able to take on those roles with kind of increasing stuff with them. And then she also talked about prominent women in the New Testament, specifically women in the Gospels. So she focused on the three Marys: Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary of Bethany, and Mary Magdalene. So this week, we're going to build off of both of those threads a little bit. We're going to continue looking at the ministry of women, but we're going to be looking at the early church. And so we're going to be continuing of that thread of women in the early church, but doing beyond the Gospels a little bit. Specifically, we're going to be looking at Romans 16 and what that shows us about the role and the ministry of women in the early church. I just want a quick note kind of about some stuff with Romans 16. If any of you are familiar with some of the discussion that happens around that particular passage, is there's a lot of debate that goes on about how different words are translated and historically how certain translations have been used to erase women and their significance in ministry. And that is a very important thing. It is important to debate those things and kind of highlight these histories and be able to bring women back to the forefront. But sometimes I think we get lost in the debate a little bit of that. And so I don't want to focus on the debate part of it this time around. I just want to really focus on the stories of these women and take the time to kind of lay that out in front of you. And I think that's going to be really exciting just to take a look at them. Okay, so a little bit of context on Romans 16. We're going to be looking at verses 1 through 16. It happens at the end of Romans, and it is a long list of greetings from Paul to the people in the Christian community of Rome. So I want to read through this passage all together, but while we do that, I want you to pay special attention to first who he's greeting, and then second, what he actually has to say about them. So on the next slide, it's going to be a little bit small because I have all of the verses laid out there, but I just want to put that all out. I'll read it aloud to everybody, and then we'll talk a little bit more about that. And I'm sorry that I can't see you back there. I'm trying to not be in the light. Okay. And come over here so I can read it a little bit better. I commend to you our sister Phebe, a deacon of the church at Cenchrea, so that you may welcome her in the Lord as is fitting for the saints and help her in whatever she may require from you, for she has been a benefactor of many and of myself as well. Greet Prisca and Aquila, who work with me in Christ Jesus, and who risk their necks for my life, to whom not only I give thanks, but also the churches of the Gentiles. Greet also the church in their house. Greet my beloved Epaenetus, who was the first convert in Asia for Christ. Greet Mary, who has worked very hard among you. Greet Andronicus and Junia, my relatives who were in prison with me. They are prominent among the apostles, and they were in Christ before I was. Greet Ampliatus, my beloved in the Lord. Greet Urbanus, our co-worker in Christ, and my beloved Stachys. Greet Apelles, who is approved in Christ. Greet those who belong to the family of Aristobulus. Greet my relative Herodion. Greet those in the Lord who belong to the family of Narcissus. Greet those workers in the Lord, Tryphena and Tryphosa. Greet the beloved Persis, who has worked hard in the Lord. Greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and greet his mother, a mother to me also. Greet Asyncritus, Phlegon, Hermes, Patrobas, Hermas, and the brothers and sisters who are with them. Greet Philologus, Julia, Nereus and his sister, and Olympus, and all the saints who are with them. Greet one another with a holy kiss. All of the churches of Christ greet you. So besides a little bit of trouble pronouncing some of those names, we've got a very long list of people here, a lot of people that Paul felt was really important to greet. you may have noticed as you're looking through this that the names that I bolded are all the names of women. And so when we kind of look at the statistics of it, there are 29 people that are named, and 10 of those are women. That's almost a third of the people that Paul called out by name in this passage, which is pretty significant for this period of history, even pretty significant sometimes for right now. A third of women for a group that's half the population, but has not always been recognized at that level of importance, is pretty significant. And then the other thing that's really interesting about this passage is not only is he naming so many women, but 7 of them are recognized for their ministry, compared to, I counted 3, some people count 5, I think it depends on kind of what you're looking at. But basically more women than men are being recognized specifically for their ministry in the church. So that's kind of cool as well. And I want to look at these 10 women that he names and look a little bit more at what Paul actually has to say about their ministry. So the first we have Phebe, who he names as a deacon of the church at Cenchrea. Prisca, who's a co-worker in Christ. Mary, who worked very hard for you or worked very hard among you, depending on how you translate it. Junia, notable among the apostles. Tryphena, a worker in the Lord, as well as Tryphosa. Persis, who worked hard in the Lord, and then calls out a couple other women as well, Rufus's mother, Julia, and Nereus's sister. Doesn't specifically talk about their ministry, but still feels that they're important to name here. And even some of these people, Rufus's mother and Nereus's sister, it seems like he doesn't even know what their names are, but he still wants to highlight the fact that their ministry is very important. And they probably were potentially working with the men who were named in maybe a ministry partnership, or Rufus's mother just kind of part of the same family, but they were obviously very important in the ministry as well. And at this point, Paul had never been to Rome, and so he's greeting people that he potentially has only heard of, so it makes sense that he maybe doesn't know some of their names, but still understands that they're very significant in the Christian community there. So I want to go through these women in a little bit more detail now that we've kind of laid out who they are and what Paul is saying about them, and just look a little bit more about when he's saying all of these things about their ministry, what does that actually mean, and what can we get from the text and from the historical context about these women. So we're going to start from the bottom of the list. Paul kind of lists it. He starts with the most important people and goes down from there. So we're going to kind of do it in reverse, talk about the people who he says a little bit less about, and then build up to the people that he is really saying a lot about in this passage. So the first one, I'm going to group 4 of them together: Mary, Tryphena, Tryphosa, and Persis, because he talks about them in very similar ways. So what he says something about them like working hard. He uses a verb, I don't know how to say that, but kopio maybe, kopio, something like that. And it's usually translated as working hard or sometimes even toiling. So that has a lot of weight to it of what kind of work they're doing. But at first glance, you might just think that this is talking about like, okay, well, they're just doing a lot. But if you research it a little bit more, I'm told that this actually is more of a kind of technical term that refers to missionary work. So it's a phrase that he uses frequently to refer to people's missionary work. So that's really interesting to me. You might not see it right away. You just think that they're working, but really this is specifically a reference to the missionary work that they're doing for Christ during this time. And then the next one we have here is Junia. She's named as part of a ministry pair with Andronicus, which is very common in this time. A lot of people are doing ministry as a pair. You see this with Paul as well, of course, Paul and Barnabas, Paul and Silas, very common for people to be doing ministry together. And so I want to talk about some of the words that he uses to describe her and pull out the Greek a little bit. I did that as well, a little bit with the last ones, but pull out some of these Greek words and how they're translated and what this shows about how Paul is seeing these women in their ministry, or this woman in her ministry. And so the first word he uses is synergene, or which means like a kinsman or a relative. And you see Paul a lot of times using this kind of familial language to describe people in their ministry. Just is showing this kind of idea of family bonds in the church, and he feels it significant to call out that kind of a bond with her, and so really shows a closeness with her ministry. And then the next word that he uses to describe her is apostolos, so the word for apostle, which is very significant because I think when we usually think of apostles, we think of like the 12 apostles, we think of Paul maybe, but we're usually thinking of men. And so the fact that he chooses that word here to name Junia as well is really, really interesting. And I want to talk about the word apostle as well, because I think sometimes we just use it offhand and we don't think about what that actually means. So I want to go back a little bit and break that down as well. And it's a word that means one who is sent off. So really it's a messenger for Christ. So you think about the work that Junia is doing and what that looks like, and she is carrying the message of Christ out to the world, which carries a lot of power. But then the other thing about this is not only does Paul call her an apostle, but he uses the word epistemoi. I really should have studied a little bit more Greek pronunciation before doing this. But it's a word that means notable, prominent, or outstanding among the apostles. So not only is she an apostle, but she is prominent among the apostles, one of the most important ones, which is really, really interesting to see. And then the next woman I want to talk about is Prisca. And she's also named as a pair similar to Junia, part of the pair Prisca and Aquila, sometimes called Priscilla. That's the diminutive of her name. And what's really interesting about her, we have a little bit more context. So we're going to look not just at Romans, but at some of the other passages that we can glean a little bit more information about her life and her ministry. So she is named 6 times in the New Testament, always with Aquila. And 4 of those times she's named first, which is not what you would expect, not what we see in other places in the Bible. Even just before, we saw Andronicus first and Junia second. And so this is really saying something about her importance. It probably either indicates her higher social status or her prominence in the early Christian missionary movement, or possibly both. But it's something to know that we don't expect her to be named first. So there's something pretty important about her. So now, before we actually look at what Paul says in Romans about her, I want to jump back to Acts a little bit, because this is our first introduction to Prisca. So there's 2 passages here that I want to just read for you really quick so you can understand a little bit of context about where Prisca is first crossing paths with Paul. Beginning of the chapter, it says, "After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them, and they worked together. By trade, they were tent makers." And then a little bit later in that chapter, it says, "After staying there for a considerable time, Paul said farewell to the believers and sailed for Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila." So we can learn a couple of things about her from these passages. First thing, she was a tent maker like Paul, and she was probably using her work as a tent maker to support her ministry as she was moving around and spreading the message of Christ. She probably became a Christian before she crossed paths with Paul, because they were kind of working together upon their first interactions. And so she probably became a Christian in Rome before she left and came to Corinth. And we also don't actually know whether she was a Jew or not. Probably. It definitely says that Aquila is, but we don't know for sure about her. So that's just something interesting to note, especially since she's doing so much ministry among the Gentiles. And then the last part is that she traveled with Paul as a part of his missionary work. And so we understand the weight and significance of the travels of Paul, and knowing that during part of this time, Prisca was traveling along with him, shows the significance of her ministry. Okay, now we'll go to Romans again and look at what Paul is saying about her there. And so the first word he uses to describe her is synergos, a fellow worker in Christ. And again, this is one of those words that Paul uses pretty frequently, and he uses this a lot to describe his fellow ministers. And so he is really calling out her ministry in this by using that word to describe her. And then another thing that's important here is that she's a founder and supporter of a house church. And the house churches were really what helped grow the movement of Christianity there during this time. This is where people gathered to meet, to celebrate Eucharist together, to preach, to teach, all of those things. And this is part of what Prisca did as part of her ministry, whereas Paul would kind of just travel around a little bit more. When Prisca traveled, she also started churches in her home. Okay, then going back to Acts again, we're going to kind of go back and forth a little bit. There's also this really interesting passage in Acts that gives us a little bit more insight into what else Prisca was doing as part of her ministry. So this passage talks about the ministry of Apollos, and it says, "Now there came to Ephesus a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria. He was an eloquent man, well-versed in the scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with burning enthusiasm and taught accurately the things concerning Jesus, though he knew only the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue, but when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained the way of God to him more accurately. So this is really interesting. We have someone who is a very prominent person in the church, very charismatic and intelligent, obviously very impactful. But even so, it was only through Prisca's teaching that he was able to accurately speak about the message of Jesus. So this is showing that she really had a deep understanding of this message, and not only was able to understand it herself, but was able to articulate it and to teach it to others so that they could become better teachers themselves. And this one is a little bit more speculative, but I think that it's still something that's really interesting to talk about. I was reading this book called Priscilla's Letter, Finding the Author of the Epistle to the Hebrews. And in this book, Ruth Hoppen argues that there's a possibility that Hebrews was written by Prisca, which would really take this, I think, to another level. So I think it's interesting to at least consider and imagine of what it would be like if we did have an epistle that was written by a woman and what that would mean for us, even if we can't know for sure. Just to think about that, because I think the way that we imagine women, the way that we imagine our histories and the people who are telling the stories really impacts the way that we see ourselves in the world now. So I think it's a useful exercise to even just think about it, even if we can't know for sure. If you are interested in this, I recommend getting the book to dig into it a little bit more. I'm not going to go into super big detail, but just want to highlight a couple of points about why this author is arguing that there's a possibility that Prisca was the author of Hebrews. So the first thing is there is no named author of this epistle, which is a little bit suspicious. Most of them you see people like Paul intentionally pairing their names with the letter. You want to know who it's from. So that's a little bit suspicious. Why? And it seems to be kind of obscured. Why would someone be writing this and hiding their identity? For a long time, the epistle was attributed to Paul, but it really doesn't match with the style of his other letters, and overall historians just don't agree with that anymore. So it wasn't Paul, somebody unknown, but we know that it had to be a close co-worker of Paul because of the reference to Timothy in chapter 13. And as we saw earlier, Prisca and Aquila were traveling with Paul, very much contemporaries of his ministry. So there's a possibility that it could be her because of that. Probably someone who's part of a missionary pair, because there are both the I and we pronouns used at different points, which of course we saw is definitely true for Prisca. And then these two other things are about the actual text and the actual writing and how this might indicate that it could have been written by a woman. First, the author argues that, the author of the book argues that the author of the epistle displays great empathy and compassion for Christ and for believers in a way that's usually considered to be feminine in the Western world, in a way that's different from some of the other epistles. And then she also says that the author identifies with women by including them as heroes of the faith in chapter 11, which is different from how some other people might be talking about those kind of heroes, really highlighting the role of women in that. So we can't know for sure, but it is really interesting. Yes?
It's kind of interesting when they mentioned earlier that Chris went to to Paul and corrected him and amplified and I guess taught in a way. And the fact that this one is different makes me think of the feminine.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of part of the argument she's making in the book, is like, if you're looking at some of the things that Apollos is saying later on in his ministry, seems to be building off some of the stuff in Hebrews. And is there some potential that that is related to the fact that she was teaching him?
Does she say in there, I love this idea, I've never heard this.
Yeah.
So I want to get my hands on the book. Do they say in the book anything about the community from which they thought the letter came from?
I'm not sure if they do. I'd have to go back and check. She kind of also takes some time to talk about all of the people who could be attributed to this letter and sort of disproves all of the other ones, leaving us only with Prisca. So I think some of that might come about as you're looking at what other people are being named as possible authors. But yeah, I'm not sure. It's really interesting read for sure. So that's Prisca. Obviously, whether or not she wrote Hebrews, she was an incredible teacher, an incredible minister for Christ. And so there's a lot to say about her, even from only a couple of short passages in the Bible. Okay, and then the last one we have is Phebe. Now, Phebe is slightly different because all of the other people who are listed in the letters are being greeted by Paul. So they are already people who are part of the Christian community in Rome. But Phebe is not actually being greeted. It says at the beginning here, she's being commended. So we'll talk about a little bit more about what that means. I think I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. But first, before we get into that, let's talk about the words that Paul uses to describe Phebe, similar to how we've done with these other women. So the first word he uses is adelphe, or sister. And again, just like synergos for Prisca, this is one of the words that Paul uses very frequently to describe his fellow ministers. So it's important that he's using this to describe her as well. Then the next word he uses to describe her is diaconos, which is often translated as deacon. But I want to call this out because, kind of jumping back to Ruth Ann's talk last week, this does not mean deaconess as we might understand it in the modern context. Ruth Ann talked about was it like even in the 70s, up until the 70s, that women could only be deaconesses, and this was a role that they could only be in if they were unmarried. Once they got married, they were no longer a deaconess. And then later in the modern church, women were able to become deacons. But understanding that this particular word, this is before all of that context. So it's not related to any of those roles. So it might not even be helpful to think of her as a deacon because we come to it as modern Christians with so many ideas about what that word means. So it's probably more helpful for us to translate it as a minister of the church at Cenchrea. But all that to say, obviously someone who had a very important role at that particular church. And then another word he uses to describe her is prostatis, which is translated as a patron or a benefactor. So she probably also was wealthy and was able to use that wealth to support the ministry of Paul, the overall ministry of the church at that time. And that shows, just a lot of power for her as well. Okay, now we'll get into the commendation and how she's different from the other people that Paul is greeting. So at the very beginning of this, he uses this word synestiemi, which is a recommendation. And basically what this does is it introduces Phebe to the Christian community at Rome. So she was not already a part of this community. She was going to this community. Paul's greeting everybody else, but he is sending her with a recommendation to kind of uplift her to that community. And I'm going to read a couple of quotes about what that means. So traveling Christian missionaries and Christian leaders use such letters of recommendation in order to receive access and hospitality in communities to whom they were not known personally. So he's sending her with this message so that she can receive hospitality from the Christian community in Rome. And then this also says that her example testifies that early Christian women leaders officially represented early Christian communities and that their travels served as communication between them. So that's pretty significant as well, showing that this is a possibility for women, even though it's just one woman that we're talking about here, one letter of recommendation, but it opens the possibility of how significant this role could be and that they are representing Christian communities to each other through their travels. And then I want to say just a little bit more about this before we finish up, about this idea of recommendation. Is why was Paul recommending her? Was it really just for hospitality, or is there something more to this? So a lot of people think because he is using this style of a letter of recommendation that it indicates that she was probably carrying and delivering this letter to the Christian community in Rome as well, not just going there, but she's carrying this letter from Paul with her, which is pretty significant because this is not just a mail carrier as we think of today. She's not just bringing the letter and like, all right, here you go, moving on. No, in the ancient world, the person who brought the letter with them often read it aloud, or you could kind of say even performed it for the community when they arrived. So she's going through this whole letter potentially for the community there. And then she's also interpreting it for the listeners. I mean, Paul's not there. So this letter is coming to the Church of Rome and people are listening to it. They're probably going to have some questions, probably trying to understand exactly what Paul meant here and there. So there's a possibility that if Phebe is carrying this letter to them, that it's her job to answer those questions and make sure that they're understanding exactly what Paul meant. I had even read some stuff that potentially it has to be someone who knows the author really well, because they are trying to read the letter in the way that the author would, maybe imitating them even a little bit. So this Phebe was obviously someone who, if she was carrying this letter to the church at Rome, was close to Paul, was trusted by Paul, not only to safely deliver this, but then to potentially interpret the message. And so this could even indicate that Paul intended for Phebe to interpret his teachings to the Christian community in Rome, not just in this letter, but even beyond that. We can't know for sure, but it's interesting to think about that could have been what he wanted for her. Okay, so to kind of wrap it all up, what can we learn from all of these? Oh, Dwight, yes, go ahead.
Is she a Jew or a Gentile? You know?
That's a great question. If I'm remembering right, then this does not answer that question, but the only thing that I can remember about her is that potentially she was a freed slave, I think, from her name. I'm a little bit unclear about that, but apparently based on what people's names were, you could tell kind of their status in Roman society. And I think that applies to her, but I do not know if she was Jew or Gentile. Yeah, this is the only passage we have about her, so it's tough. It's tough to glean a lot of information from these short things. But I also want to say to that that's not just true for women, right? A lot of these people, this is a lot of the men, this is the only time they're named, and we just don't know anything else about them. We know there's a lot of diversity based on the type of names, but we don't know specifically a lot about them. Yeah. Any other questions, I guess, before I kind of wrap it up, and then we'll get to a little discussion? Okay, great. So just to kind of wrap this all up, even though, as we talked about last week, women were not able to be ordained, particularly in the Episcopal Church and in other churches as well, until more recently in the modern church, women were active and prominent leaders in the early church. So that what we have in kind of the modern context was not always happening during this time. Women took on many roles in the early church as ministers, missionaries, apostles, teachers, patrons, church founders, even more. So they had so many different roles that they could be a part of. And it's a reminder, this is kind of going back to Dwight, what you always talk about, that the gospel flips the conventions of our world, including patriarchy. Because in this context, in the Roman context, this is not common for women to be able to take on so many different roles and have so much power and be so prominent. So it's just a look at what it can be like when the gospel flips the conventions of our world and puts this into action. And then I want to leave you with Galatians 3:28, just as a reminder of all of this. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male or female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. So we're talking about these women, and we want to highlight them and their importance and power. And this is possible because we are all one in Christ. Yeah. Thank you. I have a couple of questions here. I don't know if y'all kind of want to group up and discuss, or since there's not that many of us, I can just read these questions so we can talk about it all together. Kelly? Yeah.
Was there one of these 10 that particularly moved you, that you particularly connected with, and why?
That is a great question. I think I was probably most captured by Prisca, probably because there was a lot to learn about her, but just also the idea that she had so much power in her knowledge and her teaching, and her ability to do that, and potentially in her writing as well. Can't know for sure, but those ideas that she knew what she was talking about. She kind of formulated all of these thoughts for herself and was able to express them to other people. Obviously, I'm up here trying to teach and do kind of the same thing for you all. And so I think it makes sense that I was connecting with her as I learned about it. Yeah. Did any of you all, as I was talking about it, connect to anybody in particular that you kind of felt some camaraderie with? Also on Zoom, if anybody wants to say anything, we can hear you if you decide to unmute. Well, we can go into some of these questions.
Let me just ask,
Yeah.
Lydia
Mm-hmm.
is not mentioned in that list, but she's a pretty prominent woman in Philippi, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, this list is really just one place where it's pretty concentrated, so we can talk about a lot of women at once. But of course, this is not the only time that women are mentioned in the New Testament. And it really speaks to their importance that they were mentioned in so many other places as well. So definitely take some time to look at other places in the New Testament. Okay, we've got Dwight.
Yeah, did you find a book or any place where the information is concentrated about women in the Bible? You know, they talk even speculatively about
Yes. Here are a couple of the resources that I use for this. I think in particular, I didn't go through all of it, but Women in Christian Origins is interesting, but none of these necessarily, I think, are exactly what you're talking about, of just like identifying each woman and talking about them a little bit more. These are more broad arguments, I think, about womanhood and what this means for history and the church and all of that. So that would be interesting to know if we could find something in particular that's just like, hey, here's the women and their stories, as I was kind of trying to do today.
Were women in the Jewish tradition more valued in those positions? Were they more active in the community and so on than maybe in the Gentile?
That's a good question. I think that there was a lot of information about that, particularly in when women were priests. A couple of things that I can say about that, if I'm remembering it all correctly, is I don't think it's an either or. I think it's kind of a both. A lot of what I was reading about was more about the Roman context, so I can speak to that a little bit more. But I think that was also true in Jewish communities, that women were kind of, there are some historical findings, some artifacts and stuff that are talking about women who were like heads of synagogues, things like that. Which one of these, I don't think, I had another thing that I didn't put on here, but there's someone who was kind of finding all of these artifacts that were talking about women and what words were being used about them and what that showed about their leadership. But that was definitely true in some situations in the Jewish context, but also what's interesting to understand and think about in the Roman context that I didn't get too much into, but there's this idea in the Roman world that like the public world was for men and the private world was for women, and that was the different places where they could express their power. And so when you're thinking about the fact that the Christian community is coming up in household churches, more in the private world where women have a lot of power to kind of run the household a lot of times, that could be sort of why some of this was so successful, right? And why women were able to have such a prominent role in this, because that was sort of considered appropriate in Roman society. And I think it shows the way that the Gospels kind of takes the conventions of the time and makes it work to grow the church.
Kind of Mary, who was sent to the synagogue, to the temple to learn and so on.
Yeah.
So education was more valued.
Yeah. And the Jewish community was kind of had, special status in the Roman world and operated a little bit more, if I'm remembering this right, as kind of a club sort of idea where like, okay, well, they can have their own leadership and kind of do things their own way. And a little bit that was true of kind of some of the early Christian churches as well, of how they were able to just kind of do things their own way. Yeah, Kelly.
The only of Paul's letter, of all the letters she wrote, is this the only one where he mentions women, or he addresses it?
I just don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, good question though. I don't know if Doit or Ruth Ann knows.
No, the women are probably the place women are most mentioned the Acts of the Apostles.
Mm-hmm.
And some are related. I think some other letters also to women as well.
Yeah. Well, and actually one that comes to mind is Philemon, for sure. He mentions a woman there, and it's a pretty short epistle, and so there's like not a lot there. So the fact that he talks about her, and actually that last podcast episode that I listed down there talked a little bit about that, and they had some very interesting things to say about Philemon. So if you're interested in that and hearing another place where a woman was called out in an epistle, check that out. Yeah. Well, I don't know if we want to just call it from there. Thank you all for the lovely discussion. Appreciate it. Thank you. Everyone on Zoom, thank you so much for coming. I know I'm very small here, but I hope you could hear me okay and see all of the slides okay. Thank you.